Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. Special treat today. Big fan favorite, good friend of mine, friend of the pod, friend of the virtuous life, and friend of not filthy lucre, but wholesome lucre. David Bahnsen of coincidentally, he works for something. He owns something called the Bahnsen Group. Who would have predicted that? He's also written a bunch of books. The most recent one is now just coming out in paperback, Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. David, welcome back to the Remnant.
Well, thank you for having me back, and thank you for not doing the Lou Gehrig joke on the Bahnsen Group deal this time.
I appreciate that. I can't promise. I'm a dad, so I can't promise not to repeat jokes, but I try not to do it the same way every time. All right, so normally you forwarded me an email from someone asking when are you going to be back on the Remnant, because one of his favorite things was to listen to me mispronounce or try to pronounce eschaton. So we should probably start there and then go to the lucre stuff. How do you pronounce eschaton?
Well, it's eschaton. The C is hard, and that's tricky because you're right. A lot of times that CH would be soft. It's kind of funny though, isn't it? Because initially the kind of flack you took was over post-millennialism versus post-millenarianism. And that is
pre-millenarianism too. Yeah.
But see, I can't even, well, right. But the post side being the side I come from, and post-mill, and maybe that's why we've always just said post-mill. It wasn't to be as cool as it sounds. It just was to avoid the confusion over post-millennial versus post-millenarian. But that used to be the thing people gave you a hard time through my inbox, was that word, and now eschaton is the new one.
All right, I am corrected. You know, I am I'm an enemy of epistemic closure, so yeah. I'm always willing to learn new things or relearn old things. And eschaton is definitely an old thing. All right, we will get back to some of those high-minded things shortly, but
it's an old thing and a future thing.
Yes, correct. Yes. All right, so you have to do this under normal circumstances, but you really have to do it these days. When you're talking about the economy, we are recording on April 23rd. It is 2:42 p.m. on a Wednesday. And the reason why I say that is, as you know, the economy can swing, or the markets at least can swing wildly based upon whether or not Peter Navarro was diverted or not diverted from any specific meeting, or if Donald Trump decides to tweet something preposterous. So why don't we just sort of start with your just take on the general to Donald Trump's April and how the markets have reacted to it. Let's put it.
Well, first of all, I would like to say about this subject of the way the economy responds versus markets, and the attempt by a lot on the populist right to draw a distinction between markets and the economy, is that it's one of these things where they're right about a basic sentence, markets and the economy are not the same thing, and completely wrong about why. Like, I don't think they have really any understanding as to what they're saying and where they might be accidentally correct. The only difference is directional. That economic data, when we're describing things in the economy, is by definition backward looking. If one says, I think jobs are going to go down, all they've done is make a prediction, but you're not describing the economy. You're describing what you think might happen in the economy, and you might very well be right. But basically, when we talk about, well, jobs are good or jobs are bad, we can only make the comment because we just got backward looking data that told us. So whether you're talking about GDP, wages, real wages, which I think are very important, productivity, which I think is very important, and certainly labor data, which is politically very important and very connected to economic prosperity, those are all backward looking, and markets are all forward looking. And so when someone says, oh, who cares what the stock market's doing? It has nothing to do with the economy. The fact that markets can be going up when the economy is doing poorly or vice versa is not the same as saying they have nothing to do with each other. It's just simply saying that they are measuring two different tenses. One is past, one is future. Markets are always and forever a discounting mechanism, pricing in today what markets believe about the future. So when the stock market drops significantly because of expectations of future economic distress that would weigh on corporate profits, which is the specific thing public equities are measuring, then they're not exactly totally separate. I mean, there is a pretty significant connectedness, but just a different category of measurement. And I think that, to your question, it's been a very, very bad month for for the president. And a lot of it has to do with markets in their pricing in expectations of the future, have to have expectations of the future, and can overdo bad news, can overdo good news. Markets, because of human beings and human nature being what it is, are very susceptible to excess in euphoria or panic. But effectively, what has happened this month is self-induced uncertainty. The global financial crisis was extrinsically created uncertainty. COVID and a pandemic and all of that was by definition an extrinsic uncertainty. And we decided to create our own uncertainty. And I mean, certain parts of markets were down in March before April 2nd. It was mostly just things that were really quite candidly overpriced already. They were correcting somewhere in the range of 8 to 10%. Some sort of market drawdown that we literally have every single year. And what happened after April 2nd was markets saying, what in the world just happened? I think if you announce, hey, we're going to start charging people what they charge us in tariffs, markets would be like, okay, well, we're kind of not that far off anyways. Or we're going to really take a hard line with China. Markets would say, okay, we've heard this and that's kind of what we expected. But to say we're now going to go dramatically increase and in fact wage a trade war with ally nations from Canada, Mexico, but then after April 2nd, Vietnam, South Korea, Switzerland, and so forth, it invited this uncertainty that became utterly catastrophic.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I've watched more CNBC in April than I did in the previous 15, 20 years. One of the things that I think was striking was that I can't remember who was explaining it, but people thought they had priced in the worst case scenario for what Trump might do on April 2nd. And then what they announced was so much worse than what they priced in. And that's like that's the worst of worst case scenarios, where you come in worse than the worst case scenario that a bunch of people like you have factored into their calculations. And that surprise is what really freaked people out.
I think you're exactly right. It was worse than expected bad news combined with something, and this is not me now commentating or punditing, it's just providing market explanation. It was also so incoherent, Jonah, that markets then had to add a further pricing of, we can't really even say what the hell's going on. The notion of connecting, of daring to formalize reciprocity in the context of trade deficits was so outrageous that market actors had no choice but to say, there may not be the adult supervision we thought there was. And I think you mostly have too. I probably have a little more than you. I've mostly maintained that in Trump 1.0, there was a grown-up supervision that usually, but not always, prevailed when it came to matters of the economy. The Gary Cohns, Larry Kudlows, Steve Mnuchin's, there's a couple others too, that I think mostly won the arguments and were
also,
mostly...
we have to say, just for the record, Paul Ryan and the leadership in Congress created real guardrails too.
Absolutely. And Kevin Brady at House Ways and Means deserves a lot of credit for that. But that has a lot to do with driving legislation. Okay. But I'm even saying in terms of what they wanted to accomplish and what market response would be and why that mattered when it came to, having these discussions. Kevin Hassett has a chapter in the book he wrote that came out after Trump 1.0, during Biden's administration, before Trump 2.0, where he just basically says what I've known privately to be the case for years, but never knew it was public record, that Trump would listen to Lighthizer and Navarro and say these crazy things he wanted to do, and then Hassett and Kudlow and Mnuchin would talk to him, and then he wouldn't do it. And that it was basically the good voice on his shoulder talking away the bad voice on his shoulder over and over again. I think that April 2nd was a case in which the bad voice or the bad shoulder won. And I firmly believe, and I've had a lot of confirmation since April 3rd that I'm right, that President Trump absolutely believed that the market was going to shrug off what he had announced, and it would be all upside of basically everybody sees this incredible thing he's doing for workers and loves it, and markets would not respond that way. And I think that advice from the Navarros, and a person who's getting totally vindicated here and shouldn't be at all, is Secretary Lutnick, who is a horse's ass, by the way, basically won an argument and then have now since had to bring the good voices back onto Trump's shoulder.
So I know you think the bond market is generally okay, right? And you should explain that. But I've been using this, and I've been very careful not to say that this is, strictly speaking, economic analysis so much as a way of, because I don't know the technical operations of how markets work. I've listened to you on your podcast talk about the deleveraging aspect of bonds, the flight to cash kind of stuff, and I get that. But as a sort of symbolic, it's sort of like, when I do my whole thing about how politics is a fight between Locke and Rousseau, I don't necessarily mean everyone's a Lockean and everyone's a Rousseauian, but it's these two, they're avatars for two approaches. One is individual rights, property rights, rule of law, and the other one is the collective is more important than the individual, blah, 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 right? Similarly, I've been trying to trot out this argument that the market reaction to stocks, the market reaction to tariffs, right? The stock market reaction to tariffs is what has been driving the stock market down, and the uncertainty part of it and all that too. But the stuff about bonds and the dollar is more of a geopolitical thing. That because bonds and the dollar, normally when stocks, you correct me if I'm wrong, when stocks often tank in a perceived global or regional financial crisis, people run to bonds, run to the U.S. Treasuries as a safe haven, or they stock up on the dollar because it's a holder of value, king dollar, and all that kind of stuff. And to see all three go down simultaneously or go the wrong way simultaneously, I think what was going on with that stuff was that the ludicrousness of the formula that Trump used and the dawning realization by a lot of people that Donald Trump really did not care and does not care in a knowledgeable way about America being the linchpin of the global financial order, and is willing to sort of do things on an ad hoc, instinctual way without paying heed to advisors, made America itself seem like less of a good investment. And that's what the treasuries and the dollar are about. It's not about like what the next quarter is going to look like. It is like, how much can we rely on America as a linchpin? And it seems to me that even if you got rid of the tariffs, we're still going to be paying a price for that other part of it, because it's sort of like the NATO thing. We now know, like a lot of foreign leaders know, that we're one election away from, or one dish of bad clams for Donald Trump. We're, one moment away from upending all sorts of security arrangements. And so you can no longer plan as your own national security that America is going to get your back. Similarly, you cannot plan on America being this linchpin of stability if you know that the political leadership is this prone or this vulnerable to this kind of mercurial, populist, make it up as you go along nonsense. Is that fair?
It's all fair in theory, not just fair, but accurate. Where I push back is just the practice, the actual situation. First of all, let's be clear that when we talk about the dollar and the bond market, we're talking about the same thing. People
Mhm.
would flow into treasury bonds as a way of getting the US dollar, right?
Right.
They're essentially pro-correlated. As we're sitting here talking right now, the 10-year treasury is yielding 4.38%. And 1 month ago, 2 weeks or over a week before April 2nd, it was 4.38%. It was at 4.8% in February. It briefly touched 5% a couple times during the Biden administration. We are just in the exact same range for the bond market as we've been for years. Now, we used to be down at 1 or 2% for the long bond when the short bond, the Fed funds rate, was 0. And so that is a financial repression that's Fed induced where they're manipulating to force bond yields lower. But when we're talking about the 10-year, that is really a reflection of everything you're saying, global appetite, and what a very diversified group of economic actors believe about U.S. security, about the cost of capital, about a whole lot of things. This is the ultimate price signal. And ultimately, it is a measurement of nominal GDP expectations. So a combination of what people believe is going to be there for a 10-year period in inflation and real economic growth. It's exactly where it's been for years. What you brought up that is pertinent is that on April 3rd and April 4th, the stock market dropped 4,000 points, and the 10-year
Which is
did
bad, right? I
briefly.
mean, just so.
Yes.
Sorry, go on.
Well, except for a lot of people on the right now making this argument, and I've read it somewhere before. Karl Marx, that it would be good to destroy capital. It would be good to
Right.
destroy private ownership, and that if the Dow went to 0, we would all be better off. I saw a couple of these sort of MAGA Twitter lunatics saying stuff like that. No pun intended that they were writing that on an iPhone, well, and posting it on Meta and LinkedIn and whatnot. But anyways, my point being that the bond market did see a flight to safety where yields drop and bond prices go higher in the immediate aftermath. And then by Monday, Tuesday, that did reverse a little bit, but still in a pretty comfortable range. And I'm quite certain that was deleveraging, people having to raise cash to meet margin calls, mostly hedge funds that are overly levered. And then I think that you did risk what you describe happening, but it didn't happen. And so we just can't talk about a bond market implosion or a bond revolt or the bond market doing all these things at a 4.3, 4.4% yield. That's just like a 75-degree day in Southern California. Principally based, everything you said is true. There is a premium that now gets priced in. Part of the reason for the dollar being down a whopping 3% since all this started is that the dollar had been up about 15%. The dollar had been very heavy, and you would expect that one of the ways we'd respond to retaliatory tariffs is through our currency dropping. And there isn't enough time yet for other currencies to drop, which by definition, people talk like the dollar went down or the Swiss franc went up. None of that makes any sense without finishing the sentence. Currencies do not go up or down in a vacuum. They only go up or down relative to exchange.
Right.
Now, what one means is purchasing power. The dollar went down because I used to be able to buy 2 ice creams for this, and now I can only buy 1 ice cream. That's different. That's a different category. But we talk about the dollar going up and down. It's relative to another currency. So you haven't had time yet for every other country to try to weaken their currency to absorb their tariff impact because the tariffs keep getting delayed.
Right.
We don't know what the tariff costs are going to be. But the dollar still is the strongest currency in the world, bar none. And what is incredible about this moment is we have people in the Trump administration bemoaning that, saying that it's a negative for our economy. And so I think that the dollar and the bond market in that sense become a little different conversation, because there is a school of thought. President Trump's one of them, who believes the strong dollar is being weaponized against the US, and not realizing, this is why I think it is just economic ignorance. It's not a difference of opinion. This is just somebody doesn't get this, that the strong dollar is a tremendous asset to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I want to move on to a couple other questions on this stuff before we get off of economics. But can you just explain to the layman why it's good to have a strong dollar, and why it's good that the reserve currency of the global reserve currency is the dollar? Because a lot of people seem, this can be kind of a bridge to philosophy, but I see Chesterton's fences everywhere when it comes to economics these days, where people don't know why these institutions exist, why they're good, what purposes they serve. And they look at these things like, for the life of me, I don't know what that doodad under the hood of my car does, so I'm just going to rip it out because I don't like the look of it. And that is not how you do economics. So explain for the people who are like, what's so bad about a weaker dollar? What is so bad about no longer being the reserve currency? What is the case for it?
The fundamental first thing that has to be said is, what is good or bad is not the thing itself, but the reasons for the thing. What is good about a strong dollar is the reasons you have a strong dollar. And if the reasons you have a strong dollar is that you are an attractive country to do business in, you are an attractive country that attracts both human and financial capital, and that causes your currency to be attractive because people want to own it and they want to do business or own risk assets denominated in your currency. The goodness is not the strong currency. The strong currency is a result of the goodness. And inversely, the badness. You go, we have a really weak currency in, let's say, a South American country 20 years ago. The weak currency isn't the problem. The cause of the weak currency being no rule of law, no capital markets, no robust import export or entrepreneurialism, or whatever the case may be. That's what gets lost. Is you want a strong dollar as a measurement of the good things, not the thing creating the good things. Now, what people will argue is that a strong dollar becomes problematic for your currency exchange as an importer. Mm-hmm. Of course, the inverse then is that exporters benefit, and obviously people traveling abroad. But primarily, it allows us to serve as the reserve currency, which means there's a constant demand. So therefore, there is there's a bid under our currency because people constantly have to be buying it. So again, I go back to the cause and effect getting mixed up here. And this is just basic economics, but it's very, very important. The alternative to being the world's reserve currency, in which we would definitely weaken our currency if it was not reserved, is that therefore we lose one of the fundamental ingredients in terms of exchange, the ability to settle our accounts with our own currency. So for all of the talk about countries like China manipulating their currency, the real beef people have is that China, when they do that, gets in the way of us doing it. We have the ability to settle the current account deficit, the payment imbalance, with our currency. And China believes that we have a tremendous lever by settling in our currency, and they think that's unfair. Well, they're right, but that's a status we've earned by being the world's superpower economically. Why anybody would want to forfeit that is economic duncery at its finest.
So just for the record, that's a big part of Chesterton's point, is that you shouldn't get rid of the fence unless you know the reason why the fence is there. And once you know the reason why it's there, maybe there's an argument for getting rid of the fence, and maybe there's an argument for making the fence stronger. But until you know the reason, you shouldn't do anything, because you don't know, right? It's an unknown unknown, or it's a known unknown, I guess. So just back to this point about America's role in the world and all that. I don't think we've ever talked about TPP or any of that stuff, but I never understood why Republicans would want to get out of TPP. I totally understood why Democrats would, because protectionism and all that stuff has always been sort of, since William Jennings Bryan has sort of been, through Dick Gephardt, has been built into the arguments of a party that is beholden essentially to labor unions and, or in the case of Bryan, farmers. But the whole point of TPP was a geostrategic one as much as it was an economic one, which was to isolate China by bringing these other Asian countries into our trading bloc, into our zone of influence, and we just threw all that away for reasons that I've never heard a particularly good argument. And you'd hear Trump and Bernie Sanders sometimes talk about how it was good for China, when the whole argument was about trying to like box China in. Since April 2nd, we've seen a bunch of countries, including Japan, including Vietnam, start talks with China because we have now hammered home the idea that we are not long-term that reliable a partner on the strategic side or on the economic side. I mean, the economic side was the carrot to get these guys to aim their sticks the other way. And I mean, it's not like we've lost Japan as an ally or anything like that, but like we've harmed that relationship for stupid reasons. And anyway, it seems to me that your point is well taken about it. There's just not time for a lot of people to adjust on these massive macro and global economic things to what Trump is doing. But if you take a long-term look about the process that we have started in just 1 month about signaling to all of these different nations that they need to reorganize their relationships with us and with our adversaries and others, that is not a great economic picture. I mean, Canada, I mean, I first got this from our friend at National Review, Dominic Pino, the point that the only reason we have a trade deficit with Canada is that starting with FDR, we have negotiated a relationship with Canada where they sell us oil at below market rates. And if you got rid of the exchange of oil, we would have a trade surplus with Canada. The idea that therefore we're being ripped off by Canada because they're selling us oil below market rate is just profoundly stupid. But now Canada is looking at creating pipelines to move the stuff to their coast so they can ship it on global markets. Over time, won't markets start to getting to this point about the fundamentals versus the day-to-day market stuff? Long term, isn't that a big part of the longer term problem that this is all creating?
Oh, I completely agree. The question that is not yet answered is whether or not foreign countries are in the same boat that investment actors are, which is having to figure out, having to price in the uncertainty, the things that they hear and see they don't like, relative to the sort of expectation like this guy's not going to really shoot this hostages, is he?
Right.
And candidly, I'm not trying to overly compliment Trump 1.0 because there's plenty from the first term I would be critical of too. But I think that foreign actors still have a prima facie reason to think that Trump 1.0 is going to prevail, not 2.0. The 4-day capitulation on the trade war with 70 other countries, the rhetoric we started to see about we're going to get a big deal with China and this all coming together. How do you reorder your economic affairs that have been mutually advantageous, not only to the U.S., if it's entirely possible that this guy is just going to say, haha, just kidding. And if Canada believes all he wants is to embarrass them and get a good deal that he can announce on Truth Social, then that they have to negotiate that way and make economic decisions in their national interest that way, versus assuming he's really looking to shut down the very trade deal he negotiated with USMCA. So I'm not sure that countries are in any better of a position than financial markets, which is a negative thing to say because of uncertainty premia. But if I were the head of a central bank in another developed ally nation or a political leader, I'm not sure I would take him at face value right now either in the worst case scenario. I would assume that maybe there's a little more Secretary Bessent coming up around the corner or something like that versus a lot of the stuff we've seen. But admittedly, markets have had to test that benefit of the doubt quite a bit over the last several weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I take that point, and but my point is about a much longer time horizon, right? So, like, if you're the UK or Japan or certainly Taiwan, you can think about it the way you're describing that markets are thinking about it in terms of, well, Trump may actually not follow through on this crap, and that's fine. But if you start looking at what J.D. Vance says and Josh Hawley says and what the infrastructure of the American right says about our alliances, about our economic arrangements, about political economy, about trade, and all of these kinds of things, never mind about NATO, right? And that kind of thing. Military planners, to put it this way, military planners have to plan on worst case scenarios. They have to be factored in. And for the first time in our lifetimes, a whole bunch of countries have to price in the possibility that there could be another election that may have more consistent neo-isolationist or whatever, or autarkic or whatever word we want to use, sovereigntist. But like, I'm perfectly fine with believing that J.D. Vance doesn't believe anything that he says. But politicians can get locked into positions simply because they say things.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of foreign leaders who have to think about what does the world look like when America, when a major party that was once the party for international leadership has a leader who says, yeah, I don't know if we'd go fight for Taiwan. Yeah, I don't know if we'd fight for Japan. I'm not going to rule out force for taking Greenland, that kind of thing. Yeah. Those sorts of scenarios have to be priced into your long-term strategic and economic thinking in ways that I just think the damage being done here, even if Scott Bessent manages to perfectly Vulcan mind meld with Trump tomorrow, there is going to be a moral hazard to what we've been through that is going to take a long time to fix.
Well, and we've lived through this in your and mine's adult lifetime. There was a positive example of this with a risk premia becoming repriced over time, a long-term secular and structural expectation that significantly changed with the Cold War ending in 1990. And a big part of a repricing of risk assets, and to your point, it's not merely risk assets, but the way in which global bodies are thinking and strategizing about the future. So it's a very big picture thing. But the removal of the Soviet threat enhanced valuations significantly in the 1990s. It became codified in financial markets as a peace dividend. But then post 9/11, there's an invisible component in price discovery. It's very difficult. You could say, well, markets are trading at X after the reality of what happened in 9/11. We're now living with a certain, somewhat unquantifiable difficulty of a global terror threat, and what could it happen again, and what would it look like, and how organized was this body of jihadists who had waged war against
oil markets, yada yada yada.
All of that then becomes priced in to markets, and there is a certain compression of valuation that otherwise would not be there. And I think that's the example what you're referring to. And people want to say, like, so the S&P is trading at 18 times earnings, and if it wasn't for this, it'd be trading at 20 times. It isn't always so easily quantifiable.
Sure.
But the point is, there's a premia that does become priced in, and this is in early innings. It's funny you use the Vance example, and I'm willing to assume he doesn't mean it. I am far more concerned about Vance than Trump, far more, and this component, because I don't believe that President Trump wants markets to go down. I don't think he wants foreign countries to dislike him. I don't think he wants the New York Times to dislike him.
Right.
I don't think Vance cares about any of that. And he's a far more intellectually serious proponent of both economic and geopolitical isolationism, where Trump has always been misunderstood as a sort of Ron Paul isolationist, which is a joke, when he's much more Jacksonian. And Walter Russell Mead has written a lot of great stuff on this. I think Trump does still have he just has no moral clarity about it, which could cause him to believe that the Putin-Zelensky thing is sort of a jump ball in terms of who the worst moral actor is. I can't defend that for a million years, but I think that's different than the belief that like it would be good, like Vance saying in the Signal thread, which was the real story of that Signalgate thing to me, that he really believed us doing something with the Houthis was not fair because it might help Europe, and does Europe really deserve our help? That is a just incomprehensibly stupid thing to have said.
No, I agree, and I've ranted about that quite a bit. All right, last question on the economic stuff. Again, Wednesday, April 23rd.
Yeah.
But it now sounds like Trump will not fire Jerome Powell, and he's of course gaslighting people by saying he never thought about firing Jerome Powell. Like we both know Kevin Hassett. I probably have. I don't want to put you in a position of criticizing overly Kevin Hassett, but he certainly did Kevin Hassett no favors when Kevin Hassett goes out on Friday and says, yeah, we're looking for ways to fire Jerome Powell. And then by Tuesday, Trump's like, fire Jerome Powell? No way. I'm not going to do that. So just very quickly, like, how bad would it be, and how much damage has been done by this whole conversation about getting rid of the independence of the Fed?
Well, probably not a lot has been done other than market volatility. You had a very sharp move down and a very sharp move up. And so there was certainly some short-term volatility. But to the extent that what was threatened wasn't done or isn't done, the quasi-independence of the Fed will still be intact. I think it's utterly humiliating what he did to Hassett. But I also think that Hassett was participating in a self-own by being willing to ever entertain such an idiotic and clearly, explicitly illegal idea. People are free to criticize the Fed chair. I don't think it's a best practice, but I don't think it theoretically is illegal for the president to publicly criticize the Fed chair. But I don't recommend it. But this idea about termination, when there is no ambiguity about this, it requires malfeasance, and malfeasance is not defined as not doing what the president wants. And if it is, then all we have said is that the president of the United States sets interest rate policy.
Right.
And by the way, I kind of know what most of them are going to do. As it turns out, especially this one, they really like low rates.
Right.
And it's funny, Clinton had a fight with Greenspan in 1994. Greenspan had spiked rates. He had done it surprisingly. No Fed chair has really done it surprisingly since 94. It participated in the bankruptcy of Orange County, California at the time because it caught them off sides in their derivative book by not having a bet on rates flying higher. It kind of wiped away the mark-to-market value of the bond portfolio. And Al Gore famously said to Alan Greenspan, that this was going to really hurt in the midterms. They're doing this. And Clinton didn't want any part of the conversation because he thought it was inappropriate for the president to have those conversations. Do I think Bob Rubin and Greenspan talked, the Treasury Department, the Fed? Yeah, I do. Do I think that Summers and Greenspan talked? And then do we know that Paulson and Bernanke, do we know that Mnuchin and Powell during COVID? There is no such thing as a total depoliticization or a total absolute independence. The issue here is a difference of degree by which we no longer hold even a pretense of independence. Like, I believe it is better to pretend than to take down those guardrails entirely. And there are countries that don't pretend, that they just make the monetary policy and fiscal policy of the country one and the same. One of those countries is called Japan, and they went for 30 years with 0% economic growth. And so directly because of their accord between monetary and fiscal policy. So no, markets would not take well to it. It would be utterly catastrophic to U.S. economic growth. And what is most upsetting to me is not President, I don't like him calling Powell a stupid loser, but he does that childish and totally inappropriate stuff a lot. And that isn't necessarily to me a game changer, name calling on Twitter. What is a game changer is the people who know better. You know, when Trump just says, why doesn't Powell cut rates? I wish he'd cut rates. He is allowed to work the refs if he wants. The whole thing is so stupid to me because Powell is doing exactly what Trump wants him to do anyways. There's just no question. There's 100% chance in the federal funds futures market that they're going to be cutting rates about 4 more times this year. There's a decent chance they're going to cut rates 5 more times. He's going to be doing it anyways. But to me, Mike Lee coming out, a constitutional lawyer, and saying, oh, yeah, the president's allowed to do this. That's where we're seeing sort of my comments before on Vance. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people are comfortable, maybe more than they should be, with Trump's behavior. But when I see what I used to believe were serious people condoning it, when I see someone like Kevin Hassett, who's been a friend of mine for years, and I cannot believe Kevin would even pretend to rationalize this type of imperialistic executive branch rule over the Fed. It is our worst nightmare as conservatives who have defended the need for some central bank. All we're doing is basically saying, no, as long as a good guy is president, I do believe the politicians should just run monetary policy. It's unfathomable.
Yeah, so I see a lot of, I mean, we can now move into the state of conservatism portion of the conversation because that's a good segue point. It reminds me, I got into a spat with a bunch of Twitter ankle biters yesterday or last night. Tim Pool, who's, you know, one of these right-wing MAGA bloggers he claims, again, without his knowledge, was taking money from Russia to amplify certain arguments and whatnot, was seated in the White House press briefing room yesterday, and he got the first question as part of in the new media chair and all of that kind of thing. And his question could have been written by Carolyn Levitt. It could have been written by the comms shop at the White House. It was, how do you put up with all of these terrible people in the mainstream media when you're so awesome? Something like that, right? Yeah. And I said, this is like forget the fact that there's partisan media. I've sort of done complaining about that because we're just there. This guy is supposed to be this edgy outsider who is willing to speak truth to power, and yet what he does is he basically serves as a de facto mouthpiece for the president of the United States and the party that controls both houses of Congress. And so I dinged him for it, and people said, "Oh yeah, but that, you know, what about, you know, the press corps during the Biden administration?" And so I don't want to get into a media criticism thing, but just to make the point, I have no problem beating up on the mainstream media for being too soft on Biden. That is fine with me. I agree with it. But the notion that like the New York Times and the Washington Post didn't ask difficult questions of the Biden administration, it's just not true. If you just watch the press conferences from like the Afghan withdrawal, right, or the stuff about Biden's age after the debate, they asked lots of questions. If you talk to people working in the Biden White House, they hated the New York Times and the Washington Post and constantly were trying to like deny them access, to punish them for bad stories. But that's not the point. The point is, if you thought it was bad for the press to do softballs for Democrats, you can't think it's good for the press to do softballs for Republicans. Like, either you think a pliant voluptuary of power media is bad or it's good. It can't just be good or bad depending on whether your team is in power. And that gets me to the state of conservatism right now, where I see all over the place a bunch of people who had profound problems with, let's call it, left-wing illiberalism, and are either silent or celebratory of right-wing illiberalism. And I think, you know, Mike Lee is a pretty good example of that. you know, and I'm just kind of curious. You have always been more concerned about keeping peace amongst the tribes. I mean, I think philosophically we are on the same page on most questions, but as a matter of tactics and strategy, you've tried to find some sort of middle path, golden mean kind of thing. So I'm wondering how you look at all of this stuff these days.
Yeah, it's such a hard question, Jonah, because what you are correct that I do prefer that the fissure not have grown the way it has, and I'm not a child about it. Like, I recognize that there has been real substantive differences that weren't able to stay within the sandbox, and most of those differences really, it's one thing if it's a matter of people just having a difference of opinion as to how severe a problem is we're responding to. And some people think it's an 8 and other people think it's a 3. And so it's naturally going to call for a little different magnitude. But just fundamentally, I think what you're referring to is that there are people who would not take the bait at all. They would explicitly say, we absolutely believe in right-wing liberalism. We believe that they have so perverted the Constitution, they have so perverted the rules of engagement, they have been so unfair that the only thing we can do now is fight back under the same terms. So there are some people affiliated with, past, present, or future, at the Claremont Institute that I respect as much as anyone in conservatism. And Charles Kessler is the person I'm thinking of. And so when I say this, I'm not referring to Charles because I don't believe he believes any of this. So I want to continue to defend this sort of camaraderie within people of goodwill and good faith and serious people like Charles. But when people criticize the Jan 6 pardons, and Ryan Williams, who is the now president of Claremont, says, anyone criticizing it just doesn't realize it. Yeah, maybe it wasn't the right thing to do, but this is just what you have to do because it's all gotten so bad. Okay, that wasn't my language. That was what he said. That, to me, is what you're referring to by a breakdown.
Mm-hmm. That's an example of it, for sure.
I've lost the ability to try to keep us all in the sandbox on that one. That, to me, is just such an incredible admission that you no longer believe in limiting principles, and you no longer believe in the very things that were a bedrock of what the Claremont Institute that you run was built to defend and promote. And so a lot of this stuff it's very hard for me, and I think you've talked about this over the years, where there's political opportunism, where there's grift. There's certain people, I won't say some of the names on air, but like there's some that I've talked to that kind of wink and nod that they agree, but they believe. I will commit political suicide if I do what you're saying, and it's better for the movement for me to stay in the game. And I couldn't do it. It's not because I'm a better person, but I don't have it in me to pretend I believe things I don't believe. I'd recognize a little bit of room for some delicate, kit gloves on certain things. And I think if someone wants to be a meaningful senator in 2025 on the right, there's no reason for them to purposely pick a fight with President Trump. I think probably what most would have to do is sort of like what a Ben Sasse did, is just get the hell out. Just say, this is not a time that I can be an effective legislator in this country. I'm going to leave. But I'm not really talking about people like that are trying to walk a certain line and have stayed in the game. I'm talking about people that have literally said, I no longer believe in limiting principles. I don't necessarily agree with the facts of how the left-wing media handled Biden or some of those things. But that's a good example where reasonable people can disagree. I think two things are true at once, Jonah. The New York Times outed Hillary Clinton's email scandal. That's a fact. There were some negative articles written about with Afghanistan withdrawal. And there were probably a couple people that pointed out after the debate, in other words, 4 years after his senility was a matter of undeniable public record. There were a few people that would start to say things and try to read a little bit where the tea leaves were going there. But no, I think that for people on the right to find the left's dishonesty and coddling of either Hillary or Joe Biden to be outrageous, I would be on their side on that issue. I'm 1,000% on your side.
It is absolutely true that the media carried water for Biden for too long. I think there are more exceptions than people are willing to remember these days. I was writing columns quoting polls from the AP about how Americans thought he was too old, 2 years into his presidency, and that he shouldn't run again. It was a conversation. But my only point is that if you think it was terrible that the Fourth Estate did not speak truth to power under one president, you shouldn't celebrate the Fourth Estate being a lickspittle to power when it's your team in, right? Either you think journalists should challenge politicians or not. I also agree with you that we should just notify people that you're on the board of National Review, longtime supporter of National Review. I've known you since the early days. Bill Rusher, who was the longtime publisher of National Review, always used to tell the youngins like me when I first started there, one of his golden rules was politicians will always disappoint you. And it wasn't necessarily to say all politicians are bad. It was to say that the job requirements of being a politician are going to be in tension with profoundly principled dorks who decided to dedicate their professional lives to explicating, ideological principles, right? And that, politicians need to get elected. They're going to make compromises. That's the name of the game. You try to back the ones that are basically on your side and hope that their compromises don't outweigh the good that they're doing, right? Yeah. We can come up with things that Reagan did that we didn't love, but we think on net, Reagan was awesome. Yeah. That's all fine. I agree with that. And so like John Thune, I think his heart's in the right place. He has to pick his battles. He has to worry about, his caucus and all of that. That's a different thing. Doesn't mean I can't criticize Mike Lee for the things that he's done. But on the intellectual level, and I emphatically do not include National Review in this, but at the intellectual level, there are an enormous number of people who have imbibed what Whittaker Chambers would call the popular front mind. And what Chambers meant by that was there are people who, the popular fronts in the 1930s said you can't do anything that hampers the movement or the cause. You can't say anything. No enemies to the left is the famous French phrase, which I won't try to say in French. And it has been the hallmark of serious conservatives for a very, very long time, up until 10 years ago, basically, to decry and denounce and warn against the popular front mindset, to say that to say that you cannot criticize or police your own side is a path towards intellectual and principled corruption, right? And this is one of the reasons why, Bill Buckley kicked out the Birchers. It's one of the reasons why, Russell Kirk and those guys and James Burnham, they may not have gone whole hog in denouncing McCarthy, but they didn't end a lot of aid and comfort to McCarthyism. Yeah. And when I look around, I see a whole bunch of people who take the position that like Kurt Schlichter recently wrote this thing about never criticize your own side. Yeah. And it just, you're just serving the enemy.
Unless it's Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan or George Bush or Mitt Romney. So that's the other thing that never gets talked about. This case you're making against that netter argument, the no enemies to the right, we never remind these people that it's the polar opposite of the way they've operated for 40 years.
Right.
Everybody's fair game, except for now with President Trump in power and MAGA having its moment. Then all of a sudden, it's out of bounds for us to say, well, I know this guy's a stone cold racist, but we're not going to criticize him because the left doesn't like him. But when, I use the Buckley Bircher analogy all the time too. But I think that speaks to what Buckley did for the credibility of the moment, that was pragmatic in maintaining an intellectual seriousness. And also, Bill didn't want to deal with cranks.
Right.
But that's different than the fact that he also criticized, as a matter of policy, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, and yes, Ronald Reagan. So, see, I think that's the element of what is so frustrating for me in this is that we have a history as movement conservatives in believing it's necessary for us to have policy disagreements and criticize those that might be aligned with us in a lot of other issues, because we're trying to maintain a certain positioning, a certain Overton window, if you will, that when we stop criticizing it, it will move. I think that what is going to largely come out of the Trump moment is a future Democrat president that is going to use left-wing populism more effectively than this administration uses right-wing populism. And I can't for the life of me figure out why any of the people, whether it's the heritage folks that say, what time is it? And the Claremont folks that have moved, I don't know why they don't see it. I don't know why they're not afraid of it. Because I still do think they're anti-left wing. So why would they not be afraid of what strikes me as so obvious, that executive orders and let's say it's Fed independence or whatever the issue is, that it's going, we just simply gave a sword to ideological enemies and gave them permission to use it. I just don't understand how that is such a mystery to them.
Yeah, I mean, I recently wrote about this because there's a tension here, right? Like, if you say to the most MAGA-aligned people that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, they roll their eyes. They think, oh, you got Trump derangement syndrome and all that kind of stuff. So if you don't think he's a threat to democracy, then you have to, as a consequence of that position, believe that the other team will eventually get elected.
Yeah.
And if you think the other team will eventually get elected, you can't treat politics like it's a video game where you unlock certain powers. Because if you, in the way this video game works, if you unlock these powers for you, you also unlock these powers for the other team.
That's right.
And yet you see these people who I don't completely understand. I agree with you. Some of them I have just utter contempt for, but some of them I don't. And yet a lot of them are acting as if that their side will never be out of power again. And that does raise some skepticism about how they think democracy is going to work when this 78-year-old passes from the scene.
Yeah, well, I think that those of us, and there's a lot of us, that believe we're setting a dangerous precedent, that we hold to a conservative ideology because we believe in limiting principles, and maintain this sort of affection for the Constitution and separation of powers and a lot of these things. I think that there can be the politically pragmatic arguments that you and I are making right now as to why we should hold the line because of the other side getting in power and whatnot. But the part that no one has talked me out of, because a lot of them will just say, like Rusty Reno, when he talks about abandoning markets, he says we're going to rue the day we did it. What I'm suggesting is a terrible idea, and in 40 years, it's going to backfire huge. It's just, he says things are so bad right now, we just have to do it. So there's a sort of intellectual honesty there about like the trade-offs are terrible, but I'm willing to take them. And I just have a big difference of opinion with Rusty as to what we're really dealing with now. But he's not denying that there's this payoff later or payback later. I think a lot of people could deny the payback later because they would say if we exercise this power religion the right way, we won't ever lose an election again or whatever. I'm sure there's even some that take a Banninist, Leninist approach to a conclusion that would love to get rid of free elections altogether. I mean, that's extreme and that's a minority, but there's probably some that would say that. But for me, the part that I don't want to ever be on your podcast without doing my normal Bible thumping that I'm here to do is the main reason is because it's wrong.
Right.
It's morally wrong to determine that there should be rules for thee, but not for me. And that there is a necessary moral standard that we ought to live by, even if it means losing an election. And even if it means losing a policy debate from time to time. I happen to believe when we lose elections and policy debates, the system has a lot of guardrails in it, and that most of the things that have gone outside the guardrails that I'm deeply uncomfortable with were cultural, not political, which requires me to have a different playbook for how I want to combat that. I think a lot of the things that have happened in post-1960s America are totally unacceptable. I think not that many of them are due to political factors, most cultural and moral. But fundamentally, I'm talking about politicos and thought leaders and pundits that I would have considered to be of good faith, that even apart from the political risk they're taking by giving AOC, the executive pen in the future, I think the main problem I have with it is it's just wrong, and I still care about right and wrong.
Well, also, I mean, to move it a little bit back towards economics, and we've talked about this plenty of times before, but I'm sort of obsessed with it. The Hayekian argument about economic planning, which you've written a lot about, which we've talked a lot about, right? That experts, planners, bureaucrats, politicians, they can never know enough to outthink the market and to organize the market or the economy in ways that are foreseeable and beneficial in every circumstance. You can't do it. It's the knowledge problem, all of that stuff. And this used to be one of the most bedrock positions of every thoughtful conservative I knew. And, and I used to make this point all the time that, because people talk about wither fusionism. And I always say, well, when it comes to economics, which is really where the rubber meets the road, what the Marxists would call praxis, right? Where policy has its most tangible results. Conservatism is libertarianism in the sense that if you talk about a conservative economist, who you're talking about? You're talking about Milton Friedman. You're talking about Thomas Sowell, right? You're talking about Henry Hazlitt. You're talking about Larry Kudlow, right? You're talking about like our people, and whether they're libertarian or conservative or Catholic or Protestant or whatever, they share that sort of worldview. I mean, including like the hardcore Hayekian and von Misesian types, right? And the argument was never the problem with planning is that progressives are bad at it. The problem with planning was a metaphysical argument about the impossibility of it. And then you have people like Marco Rubio, who wrote this piece, said how he's changed his mind. He's now for for industrial policy, but done right.
Right.
And I just love the idea of waking up Friedrich Hayek from his grave and say, you know what you never thought of in all of that stuff is you never took into consideration about economic planning working if it was done right. And that's the thing. Like with this tariff stuff, you have so many people who just simply want to believe that Trump has a plan and that because he's Trump, it will work. When it used to be a sort of this bedrock view is that it doesn't matter whether he's good or bad, whether you love him or hate him. It's just that the planning itself can't work. And I don't know that it's going to be a long time before we can fix that expectation, that change, that movement in the Overton window among huge swaths of the American right back to understanding that point that they just voluntarily abandoned.
It's one of the reasons why I think I've done a fairly good job in my constant, unending criticism of tariff policy to use the language that a lot of the pro-tariff people on the right now know intuitively they're supposed to not like. When I refer to big tax and spend policies and command control view of economy and Washington, D.C. telling us, which actors in the economy they want to favor and disfavor. That exact language applied to environmental policy or applied to any number of other things is just something that right-wing people intuitively hate, yet it's exactly what's going on with tariffs. And I want to sort of poke at that a little bit. And the reason is that this abandonment of Hayekianism will be the lasting legacy that we have determined. This is what right-wing populism is. The fatal conceit will be, no pun intended, that we believe central planning works as long as we're doing it, not progressives. And guys like Rubio are explicitly saying it. And so what I'm trying to do, like I have I do a podcast for National Review called Capital Record with short little pithy contributions to stuff about the economy and markets from a distinctly Hayekian conservative, but also very faith and values-based approach, which I think is a prerequisite to doing it right. And I made the point that the issue of industrial policy was so ironic to me is that the left is going to say, we don't need tariffs to protect the working class because we can do subsidies. We can do CHIPS
Right.
Act. We can do the Inflation Reduction Act and infrastructure bills and stimulus bills. And then the right could have said, like, oh, now Trump has brought back tariffs and we want to do protectionism in this sort of Buchananite type of way to affect an economic nationalism. Well, you know what is going to happen is both.
Right.
There will be bipartisan support because once you've said we need government central planning to protect working class, there is absolutely no reason to not be for tariffs and for the CHIPS Act. Right? Why stop with one tool where we can use tool, even though both are highly misallocated resources and highly problematic uses of governmental policy? They're only both wrong for the reasons Hayek said they were, that the government lacks the ability, lacks the knowledge, lacks incentives to effectively control in a centralized way these outcomes. And so all the arguments that guys like Scott Lincecum and you know myself would make about the inefficiency of tariffs and whatnot, philosophically, your point is the most important. This is the president trying to play central planner. I still think there's a lot of people on the right that are sensitive to that argument. But what they did is they bought the emotive thing of, hey, wait a second, China's screwing us, man. What are we going to do here? And you guys haven't done anything to fight back about all these bad things happening. And so then they start saying things that sound emotionally satisfying. We got cheaper toasters and everybody in Pennsylvania lost their job. That's not fair. So you have to push back against the wrong facts, but then simultaneously call that person who's being lured away to their own philosophy, which is supposed to be Hayekian.
So we're going a little long, but one of the things you want to talk about, which is sort of adjacent to this conversation, was I got into a little bit of a spat. I hope it seemed respectful with Chris Rufo about, and I want to be really clear, and I think I was in my responses. This phrase, the new right, is misleading in the sense that I would consider Candace Owens, who I think is a crackpot anti-Semite, part of the new right. Yeah. And I would say that Tim Pool is part of the new right. And I would say, you know, the Tate brother lovers are part of the new right. But I would also say that Patrick Deneen and Chris Rufo are part of the new right. They're different people with different points of view. Not everybody on the new right is an anti-Semitic crackpot. Not everybody on the right is a post-liberal, you know, ultramontane Catholic. It's a bunch of different factions who, in the spirit of the Popular Front BS I was talking about before, fly under like one maximum flag with a whole bunch of sub flags, and they tend not to criticize each other. They try to aim all their fire either people like me or really at the left. And Rufo, there was this big write up in the Wall Street Journal about how he is inspired by this guy Antonio Gramsci, who I happen to know a bit about. And that they're going to do what the left did and retake all of these institutions by finally taking politics seriously. That's Rufo's big refrain. Just wondering, where do you come down on all that stuff as the big keeping peace amongst the tribes guy?
Yeah, so I hadn't thought about that till you just said it, that when I use the term new right, I'm presupposing everyone else is using it to describe either formerly serious people or currently serious people that I think are very wrong. And so Patrick Deneen, you know, it's interesting because of all these guys, the one who's probably like on the economic side most explicitly left wing now and calls himself an FDR, you know, or pro-life New Dealer is Sorab, and he's the one I like reading the most because I think he is very honest, and I just disagree with him emphatically about it. But I still take him seriously. Where when you talk about Candace Owens and people like that, like I just don't. They're not in my orbit. They're not.
Yeah,
people.
I want to be clear. I think I have my disagreements with Sorab all day long. He's nothing like Candace Owens, but
no, and I think he's a serious guy who's wrong, and I think Candace is not a serious person, and yet it's a fair point that the term new right could be theoretically used to describe both, and so I probably need to come up with some more clear vocabulary. Rufo, here's where I stand. Okay, I am 100,000% with you. By the way, you were incredibly respectful and cordial in the way you responded. And I thought he was fair in the way he responded with you. But no, I think that where I'm in a little bit disagreement with both of you is I do not believe that we need that playbook. I do believe in recapturing institutions, but I believe in doing it in an entirely different way than what he's referring to, or what 20th century, cultural Marxist leanings we're talking about. And I think Rufo's right to say that there are certain tactics that we want to look at, but not ideologies. And yet, I don't believe that we ought to be employing illiberal tactics. So everything you said, I agree with. The thing I can't get away from in this constant debate between post-liberal and liberal and whatnot, as myself as basically being 100% aligned with you in defense of classical liberalism and not believing we as conservatives will have anything left to defend if we are willing to sacrifice the liberal order, I still believe Locke and anyone attempting to defend the liberal order when it is not rooted to transcendent truth is spinning their wheels.
Mm-hmm.
I do not believe in classical liberalism divorced from my belief in my creator. And so that epistemological foundation is necessary to my vehement defense of liberalism. Rufo and you were having a different debate about tactics, and I think Rufo is a reasonably serious person. I don't think he would say what Ryan Williams said to me. When Ryan went after me on Twitter saying Jan 6 anything goes because this is how they've been, I don't think Rufo would say that. But I think that at one level, your basic point that for those of us who have been critical of the illiberalism of the left to now condone it on the right, that we must fight against it. I mean, I've been with you since 2015 and I'll be with you forever. And yet I want those that are confused about why liberalism is so important to me, meaning a free society, to know that the free society, the rule of law, and the various things that in a Burkean context, I think the revolution was fought for, and I would go to the mat for. And what Charles Kessler has done some incredible work at delineating between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. I agree, believe all of those things. And yet I think it is paramount that we have a better philosophical framework for it than just merely a kind of godless sense of liberalism.
So you should come back and we should talk about the metaphysics and the theology of this, because I agree with you, but I would also push back slightly on this. I'm a big fan of Tom Holland's book Dominion, and I've written about it a bunch. And one of the points that really stuck with me is that, but for the dominion of Christianity, you want to say Judeo-Christianity, but Christianity, right? Which is informed by Judaism at its core in all sorts of ways, but Christianity. The dominion of Christianity isn't simply measured by the people who call them Christians. It is by the way in which Christianity has completely transformed the Western mind and Western institutions in ways that even avowed atheists are carrying water for fundamentally Christian ideas. The idea of human rights. You can come up with a theory of human rights in the West that doesn't depend on Christianity, but the simple fact of the matter is that it comes from Christianity. Conscience rights, freedom of speech, the role of science, all of the things that like a lot of secular humanists say they really care about and say that you don't need to believe in God to believe in these things. They're right that you don't necessarily need to believe in God to believe those things, but it was the belief in God and the belief in Christianity that gave you those things. And I am more open to the idea that you can have a liberal order at least for a while, with a dogmatic commitment to those precepts that come from Christianity. But you don't have to, it doesn't have to all be Christians to believe in it. Because a
Oh,
lot
no,
of
but
the
that's not what I said. It doesn't have to be Christians to believe in it. That's not the issue that we're discussing, though. The issue is whether or not it can be true apart from the truth claims of Christianity. So what you've said, and I loved everything you wrote about Holland's thing, and you had a series of weekly G files that went through this, and it was some of my favorite stuff you've written. And there was a big part of me I wanted to reach out because I think people listening to the podcast know that in addition to me being a guest on your podcast, we're also friends. There's a part of me that wanted to reach out and invite you to come to church with me. You know, like I loved where you were going. I don't get accused of proselytizing much, but I'm willing to do it for a friend. But no, I think that you are what you're saying is descriptive about the role of Christianity in the West. Rodney Stark's Victory of Reason had written a bunch of this well before Holland's book. I'm adding, it's not contradicting, I'm adding to it, not merely the descriptive, but the prescriptive. That one can say there's a view or vision for human rights that historically was connected to Christianity, but it could philosophically exist apart from it. And what I'm saying is it can't. That prescriptively, our defense of human rights and these other various components in Western civilization, not only historically, descriptively involved Christianity, but require it as a precondition of logic, of morality, of reason, etc.
Yeah, I mean, again, we should have you back so we can flesh this out more. I mean,
you don't think we can solve this in 30 seconds?
No, I mean, I get what you're saying, but like one of my problems with parts of the illiberal right, and again, I don't think it's Rufo, right? But is fundamentally Nietzschean. It is a kind of nihilism, right? You know, you have you know, Bronze Age pervert and what's his name, the monarchist guy, who are doing on the right what a lot of sort of existentialist philosopher types who are, I think, smarter did on the left, which is just basically they agree with you and me and Tom Holland about the Christian roots of all this stuff, and they hate it. And they embrace a more pagan understanding about and a more Nietzschean understanding of that says, no, power is everything. Will to power is everything. And you make your own morality, right? And that is, I think, among the creepier, huge supporters of Trump, is the real undercurrent, which is that the victory is the proof of the morality. And I'll just give you one last example. You get the last word. Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, in his book, has this thing which some of his defenders love to cite as this brilliant thing, where he quotes a character from No Country for Old Men, who's the murderer and who's this like unbelievably nihilistic, brilliantly conceived character, Gigerch, something like that is the guy's name, and there's this little spiel that this guy gives that says, while he's about to kill somebody or threaten to kill somebody, he says, if the rules that you lived by led you to this moment, how good could those rules be? And this is supposed to be this brilliant insight about the fundamental failures of the American constitutional order, liberalism, neoliberalism, pick your whatever. So first of all, picking a psychopathic, nihilistic murderer as this voice of wisdom is problematic, much as it's picking an Italian communist, Stalinist, is problematic. But moreover, like, it doesn't take a lot of work to say, forget neoliberalism and think Christianity. Because like Christianity, like this is a Christian country. Lots of Christians believed in Christianity in various denominations and whatnot. That led to this moment too. That doesn't mean that Christianity is wrong or bad or anything like that. But there is a metaphysical heresy involved in some of these arguments that simply says, if we are losing right now, whether we really are or not, doesn't matter, right? Whether we think we're losing right now, that things are bad right now, that wrong people have power, that proves that the fundamental moral commitments that we live by must be proof that they're wrong because we're not in power. And that is just so profoundly heretical for Christianity and classical liberalism. And it gets trafficked all over the place as if it's this really smart insight when it is really people telling on themselves in a really profound way.
What an incredible way to bring us back to where we started with the correct pronunciation of the eschaton. Because it also lacks any understanding of eschatology, of a vision of the future. It's entirely consistent for me to say that within the liberal order, in a fallen world, because both Kevin Roberts and I believe that we are right now living in a fallen world that has not yet been redeemed to the intent God had for his creation, that in this side of glory, while there are certain things that can make life more tolerable and acceptable and optimal, rule of law, property rights, the various components of the Declaration of Independence, let's say, that there will still be things that go astray, and that we will have things we have to fight against, and our work is never done, and so forth and so on. And yet I believe that there is this vision for the future that where things will be much, much better. Along the way, there is oftentimes in this debate just a simple disagreement about the state of affairs. So some people that were criticizing you for your dialogue with Rufo were saying that what you want is to lose beautifully. And it's a very unfair accusation, but I think it's wrong not only in the ill intent they're trying to describe, but also when we talk about losing, you could say, look how bad the DEI thing got. Look how bad some of the sexual ethics have gotten. Look how bad things have gotten in certain moral decay in society. And guys like me, at least, and I imagine you too, I don't want to put words in your mouth, would agree. A lot of these things got far worse than we could have expected. But to then say the liberal nature of American politics, free elections and free assembly and free speech, they caused it, and then not mention all of the things that have gotten so much significantly better, that's a huge problem right now for the camp that wants the ends justify the means, because Elon Musk bought Twitter and all these companies in Silicon Valley went back on their DEI, and President Trump got reelected. There's a whole bunch of things that happened within conventional liberal
Roe v. Wade got overturned. I mean, for
that as well. and so I have always believed, and again, I have the advantage of this because I was raised by a brilliant philosopher, theologian. I've always believed that most of this was a problem of patience. That I never thought the things, my vision for society, I was always impacted by Bill Buckley, do not despair, fear is a sin. He's right about that theologically. So when bad things would happen, I always just thought, well, I'm here on earth for anywhere from 50 to 100 years to do some things, and I don't think it's all going to be done by the time I'm dead. But this idea that I have to win every single battle tomorrow, that is a utopian and naive and ultimately dangerous view that Mao and Pol Pot had, that apparently now many on the right have. And obviously they're not all guilty of the same extreme tactics, but that mentality is the same. Not accepting the gradualistic burden. This is where I like the phrase long march through institutions. I would like to see Harvard Christianized. I would like to see Doug Wilson's college in Idaho do well. I would like the National Endowment for the Arts to not put out pornography. These are cultural battles that we should be fighting and participating in. But the idea that we would get rid of the liberal order to do it, and that we're still going to have a place in this society, It's my favorite thing Father Sirico said, and I'll stop talking after this, to Rusty Reno when they had a big debate in New York a few years ago. And Rusty was describing these committees that we need to really make sure that we can properly juxtapose liberty and virtue. And he was trying to appeal to Whittaker Chambers and Russell Kirk, but he was talking about using, these kind of bureaucracy as a necessity to go about imposing virtue. And Father Sirico said, Rusty, you're not going to be on those committees. The things that we want are necessary, that we have to have a liberal order for us to stay engaged to create them.
And the liberal order, getting back to your point, is morally superior because it actually recognizes the innate dignity of everybody.
But I'm a fusionist in this sense. I think Whittaker Chambers was right, that if one said you can have all the freedom, and then with that freedom, we want child pornography, we want, or let's not use that, because for some reason people decide to make an exception for children. But if we wanted a truly reprobate society of immorality and filth out of our freedom, then I would not argue that the freedom was sufficient. It is merely a necessary but not sufficient condition for our vision of a free and virtuous society. That's a very Burkean, and by the way, a very American thing to say.
No, I agree with that entirely. And I wasn't raised by one of America's foremost Christian theologians. I was raised by a Nebuchadnezzar Jewish guy named Sid Goldberg. And he said that he basically taught me that you should always try to be a mensch, even when it doesn't lead you to the best outcome, because being a mensch is a self-reward, is rewarding in its own right. And you, my friend, are a mensch. Thank you so much for doing this. And obviously we'll have you back. Dave Bahnsen. Again, the book, by the way, everybody, is Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. Thanks so much for being on The Remnant.
Thanks as always. Appreciate it.
Okay, just say no, you won't. This is a podcast.
No, you won't. This is a podcast.